In the harsh Alaskan wilderness, experienced hunters and trackers go missing every year. But the story of this one man still sends shivers down the spines of even the most seasoned rescue veterans. In April 1992, a 24-year-old university graduate abandoned his car, gave his remaining savings to charity, and vanished into the wild to prove that a human being could survive in total isolation. His ambitious quest into the deep forest would turn into a long and ruthless test of endurance, where his greatest enemy would be neither the cold nor the predators. But the most staggering thing about this story isn't how many days he managed to hang on at the edge of survival, but the terrifying truth about freedom, a truth he would only realize when there was nowhere left to retreat and no one left to call for help. His name was Christopher Johnson McCandless. In the spring of 1990, at the age of 22, he graduated from Emory University in Atlanta with honors, having studied history and anthropology with the same veracity that others apply to careers and money. His family expected him to go to law school. He had everything required for it: a sharp mind, a stubborn will, and a family that knew the price of success. His father, Walt McCandless, was a high-level engineer, the kind who designed antennas and satellite systems, working for the military-industrial complex and the space agency. Later, he and his wife, Billy, ran their own consulting firm, so their home was built on the prosperity earned through the exact sciences. Chris was closest to his younger sister, Corrine, the only person he trusted implicitly. Yet hidden beneath this prosperity was a crack the family tried not to speak of. As a teenager, Chris discovered that his father had been leading a double life for years, supporting two families at once, and that part of his own childhood had been built on this deception. He didn't see this as a mere human failing, but as a lie that poisoned the very air of his childhood home. Over the years, his quiet resentment hardened into the conviction that the entire structure of a comfortable, orderly life was built on pretense. But it wasn't just this resentment that drove him away. He was equally drawn by what he found in the books he devoured. Leo Tolstoy with his preaching of simplicity, Thoreau with his retreat into the woods, and especially Jack London with his harsh north, taught Chris to see prosperity as a corruption and the wilderness as the final honest test of a man. Thus his plan combined a flight from what he considered a lie with a pilgrimage to what he considered authentic. It was from those pages that his pull toward Alaska grew, to the very edge of the inhabited world, where he believed the true boundary of human strength and endurance lay. So, upon receiving his degree, he did something that seemed almost incomprehensible to someone of his background. He donated all his savings, about $24,000 intended for law school, to a charity for the hungry. Shortly after, he abandoned his car, burned the cash he had on him, and severed ties with his family, disappearing for 2 years into a nomadic life under a name he chose for himself, Alexander Supertramp. By the day he reached the Alaskan Trail, he had 2 years of roads and odd jobs behind him, and they had only strengthened the dangerous conviction that his intellect, his will, and the books he had read could replace a map, experience, and the help of others. By the end of April 1992, he had reached Fairbanks, and from there he hitched a ride to the very edge of the civilized world, to the start of the Stampede Trail near the town of Healy. The last person to give him a lift was a local electrician, Jim Gallion, who picked up the hitchhiking youth at dawn, and noticed almost immediately how little he had with him for what he was planning. It was the end of the Alaskan spring. The air hovered around freezing during the day and dropped to -10 at night, and the trail was still covered in a layer of dense, settled crust about 30 centimeters thick. All of Chris's gear fit into a light backpack containing about 4.5 kilograms of rice, an inexpensive .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle with a supply of nearly 400 small game cartridges, a few books, including a guide to edible plants and a small kit of camping essentials. He had no map and no compass, and this wasn't due to forgetfulness. He considered the absence of a detailed map a condition for the purity of his plan, a way to face the wilderness one-on-one, without the hints of civilization about what lay beyond the next ridge. Galleon, who had spent half his life traveling these parts, tried to talk his passenger out of it, or at least equip him better, but he couldn't change his mind. Worried for the stranger, he silently gave him his own rubber boots so he wouldn't get his feet wet, and shared the food he had in the truck. At the start of the trail, Chris asked him to take a photo as a farewell, raised his hand, and stepped into the snow with the calm joy of a man who had finally reached the threshold of a long-planned dream. And that joy was genuine. The trail led him deep into the wilderness, across the Teklanika River, still shallow in the spring, to the rusted shell of an old transit bus, which had been abandoned there by road workers and had long since become the only shelter for many miles around. That morning, the missing map sheet seemed like a trifle, not worth worrying about, and yet it was the first subtle shift in the system Chris had grown accustomed to relying on. Because ahead, among the water and stone, his overconfidence was about to encounter something that could not be seen without a good map. The trail brought him to the bus at the end of April, and the first few weeks in that rusted sanctuary were perhaps the brightest time of his life. He hauled firewood, arranged his books against the iron walls, converted the old stove into a hearth, and began the measured life of a loner he had dreamed of for so long, marking the days with short entries and hunting for small game, squirrels, grouse, and once a porcupine. On a piece of plywood inside the bus, he wrote something like a manifesto about a man who had wandered the earth for 2 years and finally arrived at his last and greatest adventure, signing the lines with the name he had used to hide his former life. The diary from those weeks breathes a sense of free, unconstrained happiness, rare for someone used to measuring himself by other standards. By the beginning of June, the land was indeed feeding him, but the catch remained small. Then, on the 9th of June, something happened that he perceived as a stroke of real luck. When an adult moose emerged from the brush, Chris raised his light .22 caliber rifle, a weapon used in these parts for nothing more than squirrels and birds, and brought the beast down, instantly obtaining more meat than he could eat for the rest of the summer. For a man who had lived for months on rice and tough roots, this was a deliverance from constant malnutrition, and he set to work on the carcass with the pride of a provider, feeling for the first time not like a guest of this land, but a part of it. The disaster didn't come with the shot, but with what happened afterwards, when the indifferent physics of heat went to work on the meat faster than he could preserve it. During his wanderings while working at a grain elevator in South Dakota, he had heard that meat should be smoked, and now he repeated what he had learned, hanging heavy chunks over a smoky fire. Meanwhile, in the damp June taiga, professional hunters would have air-dried the kill, or opened the carcass and cooled it in cold water within the first few hours before the heat could affect it. Chris, however, delayed the butchering, and the smoke didn't so much dry the meat as bake it into a thin crust, leaving the inside warm and fertile for decay. Within 5 days, the humid air and the flies finished the job as dispassionately as any unattended process does. Larvae infested the fibers, and hundreds of pounds of meat that should have fed him until autumn turned into a foul, unusable mass. In his diary on the 14th of June, he called the event one of the greatest tragedies of his life. There was no cold calculation of survival in those words, only the remorseful bitterness of a man who had taken a life in vain. He grieved for the animal, not for his own miscalculation, and therein lay a trap more subtle than any oversight. He read the death of the moose as a moral lesson rather than a sober signal to head back to civilization while he still had the strength. And so he stayed, and the fragile balance between what his body expended and what it managed to acquire tipped, from that day on, toward depletion. By the beginning of July, the supply of rice he had brought into the wilderness was almost gone. The moose meat was lost, and small game was becoming harder to find. Chris made a decision that did not come easily: to turn back to the people and finally end his hermit life. He set off towards civilization along the same path he had taken in late April, but this road inevitably led across the Teklanika, the very river that in spring, bound by ice and low meltwater, had let him pass with almost no trouble. Over the past weeks, the river had ceased to be the one he remembered. Summer had melted the snow and glaciers in its headwaters, and the calm spring stream had turned into a wide, muddy torrent, rolling meltwater with such force that it would knock a man off his feet before he could find the bottom. The catastrophe didn't come with a storm or thunder, but with a quiet and therefore particularly deceptive change in water level, which was impossible to judge correctly from the bank, especially for a man without a map who knew neither the fords nor the nature of this river. Chris stood by the water, weighed his options, and didn't dare cross, turning back to the bus. In this retreat lay the cruelest trap of his entire journey. Less than a kilometer downstream, where he never looked, a steel cable crossing with a suspended basket had been installed by hydrologists to measure water levels. An adult could have crossed to the other side on it without touching the current. Chris could have not known its existence. It was exactly the kind of thing a detailed map, which he had consciously left at home, would have shown him. And so he read the swollen river as an impassable barrier for its entire length. Later surveys would show that he reached the water at its highest point, at the peak of the summer flood, when a few days of waiting or a few hundred meters in either direction would have changed the outcome. He had no choice but to retreat from the water and trudge back towards the bus, and this retreat shifted his story into a different, far harsher reality. The path to civilization was cut off by the floodwaters. Ahead lay only small game and roots, which he knew how to forage, and behind him there was no one to raise the alarm. For 2 years earlier, he had severed all ties with his family, and not a single soul on earth knew where he was or what had become of him. The confidence that he was free to walk out to people at any moment melted away along with the last chance to cross the river, and all that remained before him was time and what it does to a body with nothing to replenish what it has spent. On the 8th of July, he stepped back across the threshold of the bus, and from that day on, his entire life was reduced to a single task, one that had previously seemed almost like a game, but had now become a matter of survival: procuring enough food. He kept his diary sparingly, with just a word or two a day on a single sheet of paper, and these notes, which eventually stretched over 113 days, show how slowly and inevitably his world narrowed down to a tally of days lived and calories consumed. He continued to hunt squirrels and birds, gather berries, and dig for roots, but each time he spent more energy on hunting and walking than the catch provided, and this imperceptible daily deficit was the tally that was quietly mounting against him. A significant portion of his diet consisted of wild potato, a plant that is battered field guide to edible plants called safe, and which he dug up for its starchy roots. By mid-July, the roots had become tough and less suitable for eating, and by all accounts he began to eat the small seeds of the same plant, trusting the book, which had warned of no danger. This was where the false hope of those weeks lay, because the food he relied on as a certainty could, through some indifferent chemistry of nature, turn against him. And much later, a long debate would unfold around these very seeds as to whether they contained poison. Meanwhile, a process was taking place in his body that was indifferent to the philosophy for which he had come here. Deprived of sufficient nutrition, his organism began to burn through its last fat reserves and then its own muscles, breaking itself down for fuel. And because of this, with every passing week, every movement became more difficult, and simple walking in search of food turned into a struggle to the limit. Hunger dulled his thoughts, narrowing his focus to the immediate, to the fire, to a sip of water, to the next morsel, and the man who had only recently mused about freedom and meaning now measured his day only by whether he had managed to get up and find something, anything, to eat. On the 94th day, towards the end of July, a sense of alarm broke through in the diary, something that had not been in his entries before. He noted that he had become extremely weak, that the seeds were to blame, that it was difficult for him even to stand on his feet, that he was starving, and that his situation had become extremely dangerous. Before this line, nothing in his notes betrayed a man on the edge, save for mild malnutrition, but now, in just a few words, the chasm was revealed between who he was at the start of the summer and what a month of fading away had turned him into. And yet he held on, marking the passing days with the stubbornness of a man who refused to give up. On the 5th of August, he wrote that he had lasted 100 days, that he had managed it after all, but that he was in the weakest state of his entire life and that death was looming over him as a serious threat. In these words, there was no longer any of his former self-assurance. There was only a sober, almost humble acknowledgement of where things had arrived. Over the last week of that period, his entire haul amounted to 5 squirrels and 1 grouse, and on the 11th of August he caught 1 more ptarmigan, and these pitiful figures show how the flow of food that had been sustaining his life was finally running dry. While one man was fading away day by day in a remote corner of Alaska, the rest of the world went on as usual, unaware that this countdown was taking place somewhere. The only thread that still connected Chris to people was thin to the point of being invisible. Back in late April, just before leaving the roads, he had sent a short postcard from Fairbanks to a man named Wayne Westerberg, the very person for whom he had once worked at a grain elevator in South Dakota, and whom he considered a good friend. In that postcard he wrote that it was his last message, that he was heading into the wild, asked for all mail that arrived in his name to be returned to the senders, and added that if the adventure turned out to be fatal, he wanted Westerberg to know what a wonderful person he was. But this very letter, which could have served as a warning signal, itself explained away the long silence in advance, and asked not to be alarmed. Chris had not specified a return date or a route, and his parents did not even know their son was in Alaska, so there was simply no agreed-upon day by which he would have been missed. The world did not rush to his aid, not out of callousness, but because it had not received a single reason to be concerned. In any ordinary story of this kind, a search and rescue operation would have been underway by this time. Helicopters would have been mapping the area, and ground teams would have been combing through grid after grid. Here, nothing was launched because there was no one to launch it, and no basis upon which to do so. Chris had no radio beacon or means of communication with him. He had left no itinerary and had not named a date by which he promised to return. And without a single one of these conditions, no operation can be born, for rescuers do not go looking for someone whose disappearance has not been reported. The role of a silent sentry was played by the Stampede Trail itself, remote and almost deserted, cut off from civilization by that same flooded river. The only way he could have been discovered at all was by the chance arrival of someone at the bus, a hunter or a local resident wandering into these parts on their own business, and he could do nothing to influence this fragile coincidence. Realizing this as his strength waned, he turned his last hope not to rescuers, who were not there, but to the nameless traveler who might one day come upon his bus. By mid-August, his body had almost completely failed him. Of the strong young man he once was, only a shell remained, skin and bones. and he no longer had the strength for long-distance hunting or long walks, so his entire world shrank to the bus and the nearby thickets. Realizing that he could not escape this trap on his own, he wrote a note and fixed it in a prominent place by the entrance, addressing anyone who might one day come there. He asked the potential guest to stay and save him, wrote that he was severely ill, near death, and too weak to get out on his own, that he was all alone and that this was not a joke, and added that he had stepped out nearby to pick berries and would return soon, and signed it with his real name. And yet, there was no panic or bitterness in his final actions. Among the books that kept him company in the iron walls, there was a volume of a writer's memoirs, and from its page Chris tore out a leaf to leave a few farewell words written in large block letters. He wrote that he had lived a happy life and was grateful for it, that he was saying goodbye to everyone and wishing everyone well, and in his words there was no bitterness, only the quiet reconciliation of a man looking back on the path he had traveled without regret. At that same time, on the 13th of August, he took out his camera for the last time and photographed himself by the bus, emaciated almost beyond recognition, with that note in his hand and his palm weakly raised for farewell. His diary ended around the 12th of August with a brief note, one of over 100 he had left. After it, the blank paper tells nothing more, and not a single word remains of what happened next within those iron walls, because the man who had been the sole witness to his own story for all these months had finally fallen silent. Nearly 3 weeks passed before people came into this wilderness. On the 6th of September 1992, several moose hunters made their way up the Stampede Trail to the old bus, among them Gordon Sammel and Ken Thompson. And shortly after, a local resident named Butch Killian arrived on a small all-terrain vehicle. A heavy smell was coming from the bus. The very note pleading for help was hanging at the entrance, and peering inside, Sammel made out a sleeping bag on the bunk, and inside it, what remained of a man. Chris was lying in the sleeping bag his mother had once sewn for him, and it was clear he had been dead for at least a week, and Killian used his radio to call the state police. The next day, Alaska State Troopers flew to the bus and airlifted the body, along with the diary and 5 rolls of exposed film, which contained his entire solitary life by the river, right up to his final self-portrait. An autopsy was performed on the remains in Anchorage, and it confirmed what every photograph had already suggested. The body weighed about 30 kilograms, just 67 pounds, and there was not a trace of subcutaneous fat left on it. The state coroner's report was dry and unambiguous. The cause of death was exhaustion. Simply put, starvation. The diary was used to reconstruct the tally of his final days, about 113 days of solitude that ended in mid-August. The deceased was only 24 years old, an age in which he had packed more searching and extreme decisions than others fit into an entire lifetime. It proved harder to identify the deceased as he had been living under an assumed name and almost had no documents with him, and it was only on the 19th of September that he was finally identified by matching an expired passport, the self-portrait shots, and dental records. The task of notifying his family fell to Chris's half-brother, Sam, whom the investigator had tracked down, as his parents had by then moved from their former home. It was Sam, one of the children from that second, once hidden family of his father, who identified his brother from the photograph, and brought the terrible news to his parents' home, thus closing the circle of that long-standing secret which had once driven Chris away from people. The loss weighed most heavily on his younger sister, Corrine, the only person he had trusted completely, and it was she who, in the years to come, would do the most to understand and preserve the memory of what had driven her brother. This story could have remained just one of many obscure tragedies in the northern wilderness, had it not been picked up by writer and mountaineer John Krakauer, first in a magazine article and later in a book titled Into the Wild, which went on to sell millions of copies worldwide. Years later, it was adapted into a feature film, and the young man who had fled from the spotlight posthumously achieved the very fame he had tried so desperately to avoid in life, becoming a figure who remains a subject of debate to this day. The rusted bus on the Stampede Trail gained fame, too, along with a grim reputation. Year after year, pilgrims followed in Chris's footsteps, and at the same Teclanica River that had once blocked his path, others who followed him met their own ends. Among them were 24-year-old Swiss national Claire Aukerman, swept away by the current in 2010, and a young woman from Belarus, Veronika Nikonova, who died there 9 years later. After a 12 rescue operations and more than one death, the state authorities decided on a drastic measure. On the 18th of June 2020, they airlifted the bus out by helicopter and moved it to a university museum, finally putting an end to this dangerous pilgrimage. For all its notoriety, this story remains shrouded in mystery. The main debate centers on what exactly finished Chris off, aside from starvation. Among the decades, researchers have pointed to various toxins in wild potato seeds, while other chemists, having studied the very same seeds, found no poison at all, so there is still no definitive answer. Even smaller details remain disputed, from the exact day of his death to how many days he actually held out, and these gaps, it seems, may never be filled. But perhaps the most important thing he said himself, long before, written in pencil in the margins of one of his books. Among his reading, he noted a simple thought, that happiness is only real when shared. These words, found later among his belongings, ring louder than any accusation. A man went into the wild to free himself from everything superfluous, only to discover, at a great cost, that the only thing truly superfluous was his own solitude. The story of Chris McCandless leaves behind more than just sadness. It leaves a profound, almost uncomfortable feeling. He ran from pretense, money, and the expectations of others to prove to himself that a person could be entirely free and self-sufficient. But the great irony of his fate is that he only arrived at the ultimate truth on the threshold of death, writing in the margins of his book, "Happiness only real when shared." The central irony of this drama is that the answers Chris traveled to the ends of the earth to find had been waiting for him among people all along. Where is the line between a brave search for oneself and a destructive flight from reality? And why do we sometimes need to be in total isolation to understand the value of a simple human connection? Let me know in the comments, how do you see Chris? As a romantic and a truth seeker who dared to challenge the system, or simply as a headstrong youth who underestimated the harsh laws of nature? I'm very keen to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It's the best support and motivation for me to keep working on new episodes. There are many more gripping stories ahead about people who tested the limits of human endurance. Thanks for watching, take care, and see you soon.